An important organ that is involved in the transmission of sensory information to the cerebral cortex is the thalamus, but the thalamus is a complex organ that carries out many other functions. But in terms of sensory transmission, the thalamus conveys that sensory input to the cerebral cortex through synaptic connections. And in doing so, the purpose of these synaptic connections through the thalamus is that the incoming information can be modulated, and so that the correct type of information getting to the cerebral cortex arrives. The thalamus is made up of 50 distinct nuclei. Once again, when we talk about nuclei or a nucleus, it refers to a cluster of neurons inside the central nervous system. And once information comes in, information goes out, and those output axons travels through what's called the internal capsule in the brain. There are four major groups of connections described in terms of the physical location and cluster of the thalamus, and that would be the anterior group, medial, ventral, and posterior groups. And we see these highlighted here. Now, there are many different aspects to these different groups, but we're just going to focus on these four groups and the major functions of these four groups. The first group, being the anterior group, receives major input from the hypothalamus and the hippocampus portions of the brain. And these are regions involved with memory and emotion and has connections with the frontal cortex. The medial group is made up of three subdivisions itself, and it does have connections to the frontal cortex and regions that are involved with memory. And the medial portion of the thalamus does receive input from the basal ganglia and the amygdala portion of the brain. The ventral group does play an important role in motor control, the activation of muscles involved in the control of movement. And this information relays input from the basal ganglia as well as the cerebellum. And this information is conveyed to the somatosensory cortex. The posterior region is made up of auditory nuclei, and it conveys to the temporal lobe for interpretation. So the auditory nuclei indicates that this is information coming from the ear regarding vibration waves in the air or sound. Input from the retina does come in through the posterior thalamus as well, and that conveys to the occipital lobe, which houses the visual cortex. The relay nuclei refer to clusters of neurons that terminate onto specific regions of the cortex. And so these relay nuclei are often referred to as upper order sensory neurons that will eventually terminate onto the cortex. The reticular nucleus is an interesting region of the thalamus, which is arranged in what is often described as a sheet, which makes up the outer layer of the thalamus. And we'll see this label here shortly. And these are made up of neurons. And these neurons release an inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA, which functions to help regulate the activation of the thalamic neurons so that they're not overly activated. The thalamic relay nuclei are excitatory in nature, so they release glutamate, which is the excitatory neurotransmitter. And the reticular nucleus, which is that outer sheet of neurons, which makes up the outer layer of the thalamus, terminates onto other thalamic neurons. The thalamic nuclei, those clusters of neurons in the thalamus, does send collaterals to the reticular nucleus. And so a collateral is a branch of a neuron that terminates into a different structure than another branch of that neuron. And so these thalamic outgoing nuclei, which are sending bioelectrical signals towards the cerebral cortex, will send essentially a copy of that bioelectrical signal to the reticular nucleus, the outer portion of the thalamus. And the function here is to modulate the activity of the thalamic nuclei, and that occurs through the balance of inhibitory and excitatory signals. And this functions to maintain what's called the stream of information. This is the transmission of bioelectrical signals that will terminate into the cerebral cortex or through what's called the thalamocortical stream. And the label here that's outlined in the red box tries to demonstrate this outer sheet, this shaded area that's cut here represents that outer sheet over the thalamus, which is made up of these neurons. So this ends our second video of part 3 of the somatosensory system.